Our story begins with the red minotaur charging towards our protagonist. The protagonist then exclaims, "What the hell is a low-rank monster like a minotaur doing down here on the lower floor?" He asks Bayer if he has a plan. Bayer responds, "Yes, I have a plan, but it's just for you." Then, he stabs our protagonist in the back. Due to the injury, the protagonist falls to the ground, bleeding heavily. The protagonist says, "Man, I can't believe you planned to abandon me here from the start." Bayer, smiling, replies, "Well, obviously, right? Who would want to work with a useless person like you?" With that, the protagonist's group starts running, leaving him behind, writhing in pain on the floor. The protagonist begins to scream in anger, but the red minotaur is already right in front of him, ready to deliver a fatal blow. The protagonist dodges the minotaur's initial attacks, lamenting that this might be the end for him. Suddenly, with a powerful strike from the minotaur, the ground collapses, and they both fall to the lower floor. The scene cuts, and when the protagonist opens his eyes again, he realizes that the minotaur's massive body cushioned his fall. He thinks it's only a matter of time before he dies there, either from blood loss or hunger. The protagonist begins to inspect the dead minotaur's body and thinks, "Man, what am I even thinking? What if I tried to eat this monster?" He remembers the miserable life he's led, and suddenly hears a voice saying, "Listen well, child. No matter how hard and painful it gets, you must never give up on your life." With that, the protagonist stands up and brutally devours the minotaur. It's said that if a human exhausts all their energy, they must eat monster meat, rich in mana. The mana particles invade the protagonist's body, replenishing his lost blood and satisfying his hunger, bringing about an unexpected transformation. The protagonist gains a skill called Thunder Roar, which intimidates all opponents in the area. He also gains the physical enhancement ability, temporarily boosting his strength. The protagonist begins to scream and attack everything around him, attracting the attention of other monsters. The protagonist says, "They're all coming in swarms. Well, which one of us is getting eaten now?" It's said that this is the adventure of a solitary person who broke some taboos. By devouring the red minotaur, the huge cut on the protagonist's back begins to heal. A giant aura appears around the protagonist, and it's said that he has acquired the Batilla's ability. The monsters in the dungeon observe the protagonist. A noble's diary once said that devouring monsters is taboo, as the human absorbs the monster's evil essence. The first symptom is insane euphoria, followed by physical strengthening, headache, nausea, poisoning, and finally, sudden death. The protagonist, killing all the monsters, promises revenge against his former group. If the person doesn't die, a rare thing can happen. They can transform into a monster. After devouring other monsters, the protagonist unlocks the abilities of evaluation, echolocation, and absorption. He faces a giant snake, uses the lightning cloak, and electrocutes it, gaining the poison mist ability. He continues killing other monsters, gaining web manipulation after defeating a spider. Exhausted, he says he thinks he can stay alive, but many more monsters start appearing. The protagonist then looks at all those monsters and says, "Man, you've got to be kidding me. God is trolling me, but I will definitely make it back home alive." The scene then shifts to the border town of Bologna, a territory housing several labyrinths, including the Miasma Labyrinth. The dense haze of this labyrinth continues to affect the vision of all adventurers who pass through it. The protagonist says, "All the other adventurers always hated this labyrinth, but I always visit it. Before I knew it, I was being called the Miasma Scavenger." The protagonist then reaches a plantation and comments that there was a lot of miasma today, and he was on the 6th floor of the dungeon. Miasma is a grass with purifying effects and is an irreplaceable source of income for the protagonist. After all, everyone needs to make money. The protagonist says, "Well, I won't pick much this time, just enough for 3 days." Suddenly, a few rats appear beside the protagonist. He comments that they are called miasma rats, and many of the monsters living there use miasma and are toxic, contributing to the reason adventurers don't like going to that place. But against the protagonist, it simply doesn't work, as he passes through the poison smoke easily and starts slicing all the rats in half. After stabbing one, another jumps onto his arm, almost biting his face. Suddenly, the rat starts to glow golden inside a sphere of energy and explodes right in front of the protagonist. Suddenly, a group of adventurers arrives and says, "Wow, a lost guy." Another one comments, "That's why I told you not to use all your power before getting closer." The protagonist thinks, "I think I've seen these guys at the Adventurers Guild many times." A girl extends her hand to the protagonist, apologizing and asking if his name is Rudd, saying she noticed he was fighting and just wanted to help. The protagonist gets up by himself and says, "I appreciate the sentiment, but it would be nice if you gave a warning before blasting power in my face." The man responds, "That's why I yelled fireball, right?" The chubby one comments, "The miasma colony really was here, and the group says they were lucky to find it." The protagonist realizes and says, "So you followed me here because you wanted to see my harvest." The shortest and cockiest member of the group responds, "We're just adventurers making a living in this labyrinth, and by mere coincidence, we found you here, saving your life. You must be the miasma scavenger who can't even say a proper thank you." The group, with malicious looks, starts drawing their weapons to attack the protagonist. Seeing the situation, the protagonist had no choice. He apologizes for doubting their words and thanks them for saving his time. The scene then shifts to Bologna. At the Full Belly restaurant, the protagonist is there, lying on the floor, and one of the guys says, "You miasma scum, every time you're here at the restaurant, the smell makes the food taste awful." He continues, "You're doing this because it seems like you can't use your head. An adventurer is someone capable of defeating monsters, but you, with that useless ability, nullification, are not a real adventurer. In fact, you're just trash." It's explained that nullification is the protagonist's only ability, useful for exploring miasma labyrinths, but inadequate for defeating monsters, big or small, which is the most vital thing for an adventurer. Since he has no combat abilities, he was never welcome at parties and was named the miasma scavenger for seeking out low-level items inside that miasma labyrinth. In other words, due to the protagonist's flawed abilities, he is seen as a fraud by other adventurers. He's already an adult man, but unfortunately, he still has to fight life and death battles against mere rats. Lying in his bed, he wonders if he can really continue living his life like this, being a miasma scavenger. The scene then shifts to the Adventurers Guild. The protagonist enters and says he needs to find another colony as soon as possible while he still has some money. He enters the room and wonders, what's going on here? It seems much noisier today. The protagonist approaches the receptionist and asks, "Do you have any good requests today?" The woman responds, "You're the miasma hunter, aren't you? So, kid, a new labyrinth has been discovered." This makes the protagonist very excited, and the woman continues, "This new place is filled with various treasures and unity magic, a golden opportunity for any adventurer." The protagonist thinks, "So that's why it's so noisy here today." The woman adds, "Oh, and about the miasma herb you usually hunt, from today on, its price will drop a bit." The protagonist is outraged. Why is the miasma price dropping so much? The woman explains, "The miasma labyrinth has never been so popular, and since people will go to the new labyrinth, there won't be demand." She continues, "The new labyrinth is in the Avelio Mountains, but entry is not allowed." The protagonist asks, "Why is entry not allowed?" She replies, "The exploration requirement for the new labyrinth is being rank D or higher, and you, Rudd, are rank A, so you're not qualified to enter." This frustrates the protagonist greatly. He says he really wants to dive into this new labyrinth since he has nothing left to lose, and asks if there's any way to get in. The woman responds, "Those are the rules, kid. Even if you go there, you'll just end up dying in vain." Suddenly, a blonde man appears behind the protagonist and says, "If you want to go to this place so badly, why not join my group as a porter?" The scene shifts to a carriage, where the protagonist is with the blonde man's group, ready to go to the new labyrinth. The man says it's great to have met the protagonist, and that he needed someone to carry the materials from the new labyrinth, but couldn't hire anyone in time. The protagonist thinks this probably happened because all the guild's adventurers are gathered at the new labyrinth, making it really hard to find a porter. The girl in the group asks, "Why are we diving with a miasma scavenger?" Another member replies, "Couldn't you have found someone better?" The blonde man, smiling awkwardly, says, "Oh, guys, don't say that. He's been an adventurer for a long time. Isn't it better to have someone with a lot of travel experience than a newbie by our side?" He continues, "Let me introduce myself again. My name is Bayer, leader of the Scarlet Sword. Those two over there are Rick and Sasha, and the three of us are D-rank adventurers." The protagonist says, "My name is Rudd. I'm E-rank, and it's a pleasure to work with you." Bayer then says, "Before we dive into this mission, I'd like to know more about your stats. Can you show me your guild card?" The protagonist responds, "All right, I'll show you." He says, "Guild card, open," and all of his stats appear. Bayer is interested since the protagonist can even use fire magic, and the protagonist explains, "The powers are too weak for battle, but they can be useful in dark places or for cooking." Bayer laughs and says that is indeed useful, and that he's counting on him. The scene shifts again, and they finally arrive at the entrance of the newly discovered labyrinth. The girl says, "Looks like we're the first to arrive," and another comments, "Let's explore it quickly before more adventurers show up." However, when they open the door, they see it is already crowded with adventurers everywhere. The girl starts yelling, "It's going to be awful with all these annoying adventurers bothering us." Bayer says, "It seems the first layer has already been overexplored." Rick suggests, "Shouldn't we dive deeper? There should be fewer people there." Sasha happily agrees, saying they will do just that. The protagonist says, "That's not quite right. This is a newly discovered labyrinth. Wouldn't it be better to start mapping the first layer?" The girl responds, "I can't believe I'm hearing this from a porter. That's why you're such a low and insignificant rank." Bayer intervenes, "It's It's best to give up. Rudd doesn't really present any significant damage, and I agree with both of you. If we keep going like this, we won't get good results, so we'll have to go deeper into the labyrinth. They reach the 4th layer of the Avelio labyrinth, and as soon as they step there, a wolf attacks the protagonist. Rick arrives and bashes the wolf's head, mocking the protagonist and telling him not to be afraid of such small things. Sasha then uses an electricity power and electrocutes the wolf, while Bayer slices the other wolves in half with his sword. The protagonist is amazed, seeing that everyone there was really strong, and he couldn't even move a finger to help because he was paralyzed with fear. Sasha comments that diving deeper is really the right way to do it, especially without other people around. Bayer agrees, saying the monsters there weren't extremely strong and that they even found some treasures along the way. Rick then starts yelling at the protagonist, ordering him to collect the materials from the monsters he defeated. The protagonist responds that he can't collect the materials from those monsters because they are too damaged and their magic stones are likely shattered. Rick says, "But what if they're not shattered? You useless idiot. You better not push your luck. This group is full of losers. Man, I can't believe this." The protagonist remembers how Rick killed those monsters and knows he can't confront him. He says, "All right, I'll try to collect them then." The protagonist approaches one of the wolves that Rick destroyed and observes, "Why is this thing's body completely disfigured and crushed like this? Its guts are all over the place, and the smell is horrible." The protagonist thinks it's best to burn the body a bit first and starts doing so. Rick, pestering the protagonist, says, "Hey, old man, what are you doing burning that monster? Do you think I'm going to eat that rotten meat? Although I've been exploring for a while now, and I'm starting to get hungry. Even that horrible monster meat is starting to look delicious to me." Sasha responds, "Man, you're so disgusting. That's gross. Among adventurers, it's taboo to eat monsters since their mana would be absorbed into our bodies. Who knows what would happen to us if we ate that?" Rick says, "Well, I was joking. You take everything too seriously. When we get back, I'll use the money we earn to eat all the delicious food I want." Just as Rick said that, they all felt an incredibly high mana, so sinister it left everyone horrified. When they looked back, they saw it was a minotaur. The protagonist, in shock, realized that this monster was rank B, far superior to him and even to his group. He could only wonder what a rank B monster was doing in such a shallow layer. Sasha said it would be impossible to face such a monstrosity. So what could they do at that moment? Bayer then said he would use a skill and asked Rudd to lend him his backpack as quickly as possible. Bayer shouted for Rudd to keep his movements slow. The protagonist asked if Bayer had a plan for that absurd situation. With a malicious smile, Bayer replied, "Of course, I have a plan, and a fine one at that." He then drew his sword and made a huge cut across the protagonist's back. The protagonist fell to the ground, writhing in pain, unable to believe what had just happened. Bayer asked Rick to activate his haste ability, which doubled the target's speed. The protagonist realized that from the beginning, they had brought someone into the group just to abandon them in case something happened. Bayer said, "Why do you think we brought a failure like you, who is only good for gathering miasma?" They then left the protagonist there to die. The Minotaur began brutally attacking the protagonist, who could only think that he would unfortunately die there, with nothing he could do. The Minotaur was pummeling the protagonist mercilessly. I don't even know how our protagonist didn't die from the first blow. As the Minotaur slammed him into the wall with a shoulder charge, suddenly, they broke through the wall and fell into a gigantic crater. When the protagonist opened his eyes, he thought he was already dead, but realized he had fallen onto the Minotaur's body, which had cushioned the fall a bit. However, this didn't mean much, as he was severely injured, bleeding profusely, and had no chance of survival. The protagonist thought it was only a matter of time before he lost his life, whether from blood loss, hunger, or some other cause. He was very hungry and needed to eat something before dying. Looking at the dead Minotaur, he began to think he could eat the monster, but imagined this could lead to an even greater disaster. He reflected on his miserable life until he started hearing a voice saying, "Listen well, child. No matter how hard or painful your life is, you must never give up." With those words, the protagonist stands up with hatred in his heart and begins to brutally devour the Minotaur. As he eats the monster's flesh, he thinks that if an exhausted human eats the meat of a monster rich in mana, the mana particles would invade his body, transforming him into something worse than death. But the protagonist had nothing left to lose and starts tearing into the monster to regain his lost blood and satiate his hunger. Rudd takes a gamble, resulting in an unexpected transformation in his body. After devouring the entire Minotaur, the protagonist walks through the labyrinth, carrying the axe he took from the Minotaur. His expression no longer seemed human. A group of monster bats attacks the protagonist, who activates a skill called Roar, intimidating all opponents and tearing apart those nearby. He also activates the physical enhancement skill, which boosts his strength. The Minotaur's axe glows like like magma, and the protagonist starts slicing through the remaining monsters, eating their corpses. After eating the bat's flesh, he gains a new skill called echolocation, which detects creatures around him, effective in darkness. Activating the skill, he senses many monsters nearby. If it had been the protagonist from minutes ago, he would have been terrified, but now he was different. He thinks, well, they're coming in swarms, so let's see who's going to eat whom now. The protagonist begins to tear through all the monsters in front of him with absurd brutality, seemingly having lost his humanity. The protagonist says the axe finally fits perfectly in his hand, and that he can feel the monster's magic without even looking at them. He is somewhat out of control, enjoying his power, and starts killing more monsters. He even grabs a monster's eye and starts devouring it. The more he eats pieces of the monsters, the more he feels an unimaginable power flowing through his body. With each monster he devours, he becomes more aggressive and intense. Now, the ones starting to feel fear are not the protagonist, but the monsters. After a massacre of monsters, the protagonist manages to escape the labyrinth. Seeing the blue sky, he says, well, I finally managed to survive at least once in my life alone, and starts shouting and celebrating his feat. The scene then shifts back to the Adventurers Guild. Everyone there seems surprised, and a man at the front says, well, after hearing your report, I gathered all the adventurers who were in the labyrinth, except for Rudd, who went with you. This man was from the Bologna branch, and was actually a guild master named Lan Carsi. Bayer's trio was pretending to be concerned about Rudd, with Bayer almost crying. When we encountered the Minotaur on the 4th floor, he was unfortunately killed before we had a chance to protect him. Sasha even pretended to cry, showing an impressive performance. The guild master says, unfortunately, I understand the situation, so for now, I'll prohibit entry to the new labyrinth. Suddenly, the receptionist, who was feeling down, is surprised to see someone at the door. When everyone looks back, they see that it is Rudd, the protagonist, entering. Everyone exclaims, no way, how is this kid not dead? Rudd's return shocks Bayer's group. Bayer, very insincere and shameless, hugs the protagonist, asking if he is alright. He gets close to Rudd's ear and whispers, if you say anything unnecessary in front of everyone, I will definitely kill you here. All the group's false members ask if the protagonist is injured, saying they went back to look for him, but the labyrinth was already closed. Bayer then says, guys, anyway, let's celebrate our dear friend's survival. But of course, let's not celebrate in a place like this, right, Rudd? When Bayer touches the protagonist's shoulder, he feels something strange, as he couldn't move a muscle. The protagonist, very serious, shouts for everyone to hear, these bastards used me as a pawn, scaring everyone present. Bayer, embarrassed, asks, Rudd, what are you talking about? Why are you saying that? The guild master interrupts, boy, what do you mean by being used as a pawn? Without hesitation, the protagonist responds, Bayer stole all my supplies and attacked me from behind. Rick used his skill to lure the monster to me, and Sasha used a speed skill for the three of them to escape and leave me behind. Bayer, locked in fear, desperately tells the guild master that they did nothing of the sort, claiming that Rudd was hallucinating from the blow. The guild master, looking at a person entering through the door, says, now we will clarify the truth. A small woman with white hair, looking like a sorceress, enters the room, leaving everyone surprised. She was an officer of truth, who rarely left the royal capital. The guild master explains that due to the unusual number of deaths among temporary porters, he brought the officer of truth. He then asks the officer, please respond to the complaints from Bayer and Rudd. Could you verify the truth of this story and tell us who is being honest? The officer removes the cloth from her mouth and says, the members of the Scarlet Sword are lying. She raises her staff, which emits an intense light around everyone, and declares Rudd's complaints are entirely true. Everyone is impressed by her statement, and whispers begin about Bayer's group's motives. Bayer, not taking the situation well, starts to go mad and says, how could a spoiled little girl like you know something so precisely? The guild master responds, this little girl has the truth ability, a skill impossible to obtain later in life, rivaling even unique abilities. Absolutely no lie, not even from the world's greatest liar, can pass through this ability. He continues, what could be more reliable than the words of someone who dedicated this great power to her country to help all the wronged people? Who do you think I would believe? Boy, the guild master says, abandoning a comrade during an expedition, adventure, or in labyrinths is a huge taboo among adventurers. And not just that, you intentionally threw your comrades to die as pawns. Even if everyone here continues investigating your crimes, it's certain that your adventure certification will be revoked. All of you will be reduced to slavery, and rightly so. Sasha begins to have a severe anxiety attack, crying and saying that this can't be possible. Rick, the toughest one, says, man, you must be kidding me. How can you do this to us? Bayer, the most outraged, says, how can someone as talented as me become a slave? This doesn't make any sense. He looks at at the officer of truth with hatred and says, "If this meddler weren't here, no one would have ever discovered my foolproof plan." Blinded by rage, Bayer charges with his sword to attack the girl. He was so distraught that he didn't care about all the witnesses to the atrocity. This action surprised the protagonist, the guild master, and the officer of truth. But with incredible speed, the protagonist dashes forward and protects the girl with his sword, leaving Bayer shocked at the agility of someone of a lower rank. The protagonist, with a fierce look, says, "Don't you dare touch the officer of truth with your filthy hands." Bayer couldn't believe that Rudd had stopped his attack. The protagonist then delivers a punch so powerful that it sends Bayer flying, creating a massive crater in the wall. Sasha and Rick are impressed by the protagonist's strength, especially since they were the ones who mocked him the most in the labyrinth. The protagonist says, "Well, I guess I overdid it. That wasn't very good." The guild master takes the protagonist to the reception room and says, "Sorry to bother you, kid, but we need to talk a bit. I know you're tired, but I hope you understand." The protagonist responds that it's all right because this is very important. The guild master explains that the three will be taken by the reconnaissance team, interrogated, and if confirmed that they used porters as bait, they will lose all their positions and qualifications as adventurers and be reduced to slavery. Bayer went as far as to defy the officers of truth, so he probably won't be seen again. Anyway, they will lose the rights to the profits obtained in the new labyrinth. It's only fair that you receive all of this. There are about 200,000 Regins in this bag, so please accept it. The protagonist leaves the room with the bag full of money, very happy, thinking that he could cover all his expenses. Earning that much money by capturing miasma grass would take more than a century. He realizes that adventurers can really make a lot of money. Looking around, he notices that no one is insulting him, perhaps because they saw what he did to Bayer. This doesn't mean they will be kind, but he thinks, if I stand out more, some will think I'm rising too quickly, which will be suspicious. So, I guess I should continue making money in the miasma labyrinth, just like before. The protagonist says to himself, I need to stop being sad and do something about it. I finally got some significant money. I'll prepare all my equipment and eat whatever I want. But first, I'll head to the tool shop. He comes across a bag and wonders if it's really magical. Changing his mind, he says, well, I think I'll grab something to eat first. The scene then advances to the next few days. The protagonist is in the middle of a mine, killing a bunch of monster rats. He thinks, who would have thought they could be defeated so easily? And to think I had to escape from 5 of them to avoid dying a few days ago. The protagonist then activates one of his skills, called evaluation, and starts analyzing the dead rat's body. He notes all the attributes of the monster and realizes that the skill he gained from eating those monsters can be used on corpses. Seeing the rat's level, he thinks, I wonder how much my level has increased now. Since I killed that rat so easily, I must be around level 20. The protagonist then checks his status and sees that he is an E rank, level 42, which shocks him because he had advanced so much. He was level 7 the day before. This is very rare. I need to see what skills I've acquired, he thinks, opening his skills section. He has so many skills that they don't fit on the screen. The protagonist is thrilled with all of this, as he went from a complete failure to someone extremely powerful. The protagonist looks at the wall that was broken during the fight with the red minotaur, now sealed. The labyrinth will probably remain closed for a long time. He had planned to slowly explore the miasma labyrinth, but now he wants to test his new skills in the deeper floors. He also wants to test the bag he bought, not even knowing if it was magical. I want to choose the right monster for my first try. I'll go to the 6th floor, he says. The protagonist descends floor by floor, slaughtering monsters along the way. After passing through several floors and killing many monsters, he reaches the 24th floor and encounters a humanoid lizard. The protagonist activates the evaluation skill again and sees that the monster is level 25, from the dragon tribe race, lizard soldier. They usually fight in coordination with their companions, but there's only one here. That's strange. It might be worth trying to kill it, he thinks. Without thinking twice, the protagonist charges with his sword to cut the lizard's neck, but the lizard notices the attack and dodges, resulting in a cut on its arm. You're not too bad, but next time, I won't miss, says the protagonist. As he considers his next move, the lizard flees into a dead-end alley. Now you have nowhere to escape, says the protagonist, but realizes it was a trap. There were more lizards with it. Worried, the protagonist thinks he was too confident. Even with a vast difference in level, the situation was dire. The lizards begin to attack, but he dodges easily. If that's the case, I'll take them down one by one, the protagonist thinks. He focuses on one lizard, but is interrupted by another that throws him aside. Another lizard nearly hits his head. That was close. Almost got me, he says, smiling. The protagonist sees many lizards around him and wonders how many there are. Observing the situation, he hears a loud sound and notices a distinct lizard in the back. Using evaluation. He sees that it is the lizard general, level 32. Ah, I finally found their leader. So you're the boss, he thinks. The lizard general begins to shout, and all the other lizards start attacking the protagonist insanely. The protagonist activates his physical enhancement skill and starts beating up all the lizards that jump at him, crushing one's head with a stomp and using the momentum to attack the general. The protagonist lands a full sword strike on the general's chest, but is shocked to see that nothing happened. The general, wasting no time, prepares to attack the protagonist point blank. The protagonist thinks he can't avoid the blow at that distance and activates his steel body skill. He says, "You're not the only one with tricks up your sleeve, huh, Captain?" The protagonist wonders about the lizard's power that prevents it from being hurt and uses evaluation again to understand the enemy's abilities. He discovers that the general has skills in one-handed swordsmanship, shield technique, miasma resistance, and command. Confused, the protagonist realizes that the general doesn't have any durability enhancement skills. Observing the skills of the other lizards, he notes that they all have swordsmanship and miasma resistance, but no special abilities. So, where is this resistance coming from? Suddenly, he sees a lizard with a cut across its chest. Investigating the skills of this lizard, he finds that it has a skill called substitute. The protagonist realizes that this lizard was taking all the damage. Without hesitation, he pierces the lizard's abdomen and says, "It must be tough being a substitute, but don't take it personally." The general, furious, charges at the protagonist along with the other lizards. The protagonist uses his thread manipulation skill and leaps, saying, "When they gather like this, it makes things much easier." He throws all his threads over the lizards, trapping them at once. Reaching the lizard general, the protagonist says, "Looks like the victory is mine." Without a second thought, he decapitates the general. After killing all the general's subordinates, the protagonist thinks, now, it's finally time to eat. He takes out the magical bag he bought with the guild money and begins pulling out various cooking utensils. Instead of weapons or armor, he pulls out spices and kitchen equipment. The protagonist thinks, "When I was desperate to survive, I really wanted to try this." He starts skinning the lizard meat, slicing it into various pieces, and then calmly fries the meat. He wonders if properly cooking and eating the monster's meat will allow him to gain skills or better abilities. Salivating with hunger, he begins to eat the lizard meat and comments, "Who would have thought monster meat would be this delicious? I might actually be getting addicted to monster meat," thinks the protagonist. He then gains the lizard's skills: one-handed swordsmanship, shield technique, miasma resistance, and command. "I got new skills, but how can this meat be so good? Could it be related to the magical powers the monsters possess? The Minotaur's abilities and the spider armor have been very useful, but I still haven't tried the Thunder Wolf and Black Serpent skills. It's fine. I don't need to rush now. On the way back, I can try eating more varieties of monsters." The scene then shifts to the 21st floor, where the protagonist sees wasps and poisonous frogs. He activates his lightning skill, electrocuting everything in his path. This lightning skill is very useful for sweeping away multiple monsters at once, he comments. He notes that those monsters can infect people with diseases, but they chose the wrong opponent. The protagonist takes out his frying pan, saying now he has frog and insect meat and it's time to eat. He grills the meats, commenting that the frog's venom makes the meat tenderer and tastier, and the seasoning reminds him of morcella. He wishes he had a beer to go with it. After eating, he gains new abilities: poison, temperature variation, powder scale poison, paralysis powder scale, and aerial slice. Suddenly, the protagonist hears a noise behind him, like a fall and a human voice. Could there be other adventurers here? He wonders. It's rare to see other adventurers in combat, and if I'm lucky, I can exchange information with them. The scene changes to a group of adventurers, where a woman lies on the ground, stabbed. One of the men says, "Damn it, I can't believe she still had so much magic left." Another man comments, "But all this trouble was worth it." He pulls the hood off the woman, revealing an elf. "How much is an elf worth?" he asks. The protagonist appears behind them and says, "I had some hope of making a few adventure friends." Everyone is startled and turns around. "I don't know the whole story, but I can't stand by and watch a woman being attacked cowardly," says the protagonist. One of the men with a scar over his eye asks who he is. The protagonist responds with a smile, "I'm just an adventurer." The elf shouts for the protagonist to leave quickly, explaining that those men are not ordinary adventurers, but adventurer hunters. "Adventurer hunters? Huh, I've heard they're high-level adventurers," comments the protagonist. He sees the men's levels: 55, 52, 56, 58. This startles him, as he didn't expect such strong opponents. He wonders if they have concealment skills or tools against magic. The man with the scar over his eye, who has the highest level, orders his henchmen to capture the protagonist. The scene shifts to the protagonist being attacked by a group of guys. He's surprised by their speed, but manages to defend himself, barely avoiding the attacks. One of the attackers compliments his skills, to which the protagonist retorts that it's actually the attacker who's too weak. The attacker angrily vows to crush the protagonist's head. In response, the protagonist uses his poison ability, spitting venom into the attacker's face. The venom corrodes the attacker's face like acid, causing him to fall to the ground, screaming in pain. The other attackers, watching from a distance, are shocked and question if he really just spit poison. They comment that it's almost like he's a monster. The protagonist remarks that his way of fighting is reckless and unbefitting of an adventurer, but it's the only way he knows to survive. One of the attackers notes that his poison ability is unique and that they shouldn't underestimate him. They decide to attack him all at once. One blow barely misses the protagonist's head, and he realizes that if he stops for even a second, he'll be killed. He notices that one of the attackers has iron body ability. The attacker lands a blow, throwing the protagonist into some mud or sludge. The attacker comments on the protagonist's resilience, thinking he could have broken his neck with that kick. The protagonist slowly gets up, and another attacker threatens to end his life right there. But the protagonist simply turns and runs. The attacker yells at him to stop running and fight like a man. But as he prepares to chase, another attacker with a scar tells him to stop, warning that the swamp is poisonous, and there's no guarantee he'd survive if he continued. He assures that the protagonist won't withstand the swamp's poison for long and will return soon. The protagonist waits for the attackers to leave the swamp, but they don't move. He wonders how long those bastards will wait, deciding to fight like an adventurer. He acknowledges his luck in falling into the poisonous swamp. Besides the usual miasma, the surrounding vapor quickly drains the attacker's stamina. One of the attackers complains about the time the protagonist has been in the swamp, and another mentions that it's been 10 minutes, and he doesn't feel well. The protagonist decides to leave the swamp, commenting on the effects of the poison and miasma. The attackers, irritated, ask if he's finally given up, accusing him of causing too many problems. The protagonist responds that, unfortunately for them, he's immune to abnormal statuses and doesn't understand how much they're suffering. One of the attackers, furious, orders his lackeys to kill the protagonist. The lackeys advance, but this time the protagonist defends more easily, noticing that the swamp's poison is gradually draining their stamina and the accumulated miasma is lowering their stats. One of the hunters tries to attack the protagonist from behind, but the sword strike has no effect as he's activated his iron body ability, impressing the attacker. The protagonist then activates his lightning mantle ability, placing his sword on the ground. He electrocutes everyone around. The enemies are eliminated in a single strike. One of them curses, accusing the protagonist of cheating. The protagonist emanates a green aura from his hand and uses an ability called Air Slash, cutting through everyone in front of the scarred man. Impressed, the scarred man comments on the protagonist's various abilities, including poison, iron body, lightning mantle, and air slash. The scarred man asks why a human protagonist has so many monster abilities. The protagonist advances towards him, saying it's none of his business. He lands several blows on the scarred man, who realizes that despite being superior in hand-to-hand combat against humans, he's losing because of the miasma. Frustrated at needing to use this ability against the protagonist, the scarred man activates his agility boost and charges again. The protagonist activates his physical enhancement ability and, with a single blow, shatters the scarred man's sword and delivers a precise cut to his chest, leaving him on the ground. The protagonist reflects that without the abnormal status effects, the scarred man would be much stronger than him. The scene shifts to the protagonist helping an elf. She thanks him for saving her, saying she doesn't know what would have happened without his help. The protagonist responds that he wouldn't leave her in such an unpleasant situation, though she tries to remain composed. Her body is still greatly affected by the miasma. The protagonist did what he could to provide first aid, but wonders why an elf is in such a remote area and being pursued by adventurer hunters. Suddenly, a gigantic monster appears before them. Using his appraisal ability, the protagonist identifies the giant creature as the leader of the moths from the insect race and level 37. Its abilities include poisonous scales, parasitic scales, poison resistance, miasma resistance, air slash, and moth eyes. The protagonist decides to attack the giant moth, declaring that it won't defeat him just because it's big. The moth launches an air slash that almost hits the protagonist and the elf. He asks if the elf is okay, and she confirms. The protagonist comments on the scare and says he needs to repay it. The moth backs off, but the protagonist uses his air slash ability to launch himself at it, slicing it up. However, the moth activates its parasitic scales ability. The protagonist smiles, saying parasites don't work on him, but he notices the parasites heading towards the elf. The elf grabs her staff and casts a powerful wind spell, impressing the protagonist with her strength. He reflects that this is expected from an elf, The protagonist finishes off the moth by stabbing it in the head. The elf comments on the protagonist's abilities being similar to those of monsters. He thinks about how to explain it to her, but the elf collapses from the miasma's effect. The protagonist asks if she was hit by the parasitic scales, and she replies no, that it's something else. The elf says that once they get out of there it is out. She'll share a bit of her story with him. The protagonist helps her out the door, and they sit under a tree. The elf says she feels much better now that she's out of the labyrinth. She begins, well, before I explain everything that happened to me, let me introduce myself. My name is Alicia, and I'm a former adventurer. Hearing her name, the protagonist is surprised and asks, wait, are you the Alicia from the Emerald Storm? She smiles and replies, ah, so you already knew about me. Huh, he says, of course I know you. You're from one of the most renowned ranks in the kingdom of Ludius, the Azure Trails. Everyone knows the members of that group, but if I remember correctly, something happened to the Azure Trails. Alicia then explains, that's right. 5 years ago, we were defeated by monsters. That day, we challenged a monster waiting for us in the depths of the S-rank dungeon called the Abyss Dungeon. In that battle, we lost our leader. Another member had to retire due to severe injuries, and another was devoured by the labyrinth. Even I didn't come out unscathed. She starts to remove some of her clothing, and the protagonist asks, what are you doing? She shows a purple mark on her chest and says, this is the curse placed on me that day. It's called the low-level curse. The protagonist responds, low-level curse? I've never heard of that. She continues, neither had I. I tried every possible method to break it, but I only managed to slow its progress. Those adventure hunters discovered my curse and planned to exploit it for profit, but in the end, I'll die when my level reaches 0. Even so, I couldn't bear the thought of surrendering to those guys. The protagonist thinks for a moment and says, you know, maybe I can help you with that curse. He takes out a type of card and activates his echolocation and substitution abilities. The substitution ability allows him to take all attacks and negative statuses from a chosen target. He asks the elf, can you accept the ability I'm about to activate? Not fully understanding, she says yes. The protagonist touches her shoulder. A purple aura emanates from his hand, and he activates the substitution ability, transferring the curse from the elf to himself. The elf asks him to stop, worried that he might be affected by the curse, but he smiles and says, relax, it's okay, trust me. Suddenly, the curse manifests behind the protagonist, impressing the elf. After transferring the curse, he activates his unique ability to nullify abnormal statuses, making the curse disappear instantly. The protagonist says, well, I think it worked, right? The elf, amazed, checks her guild card and sees that she's S rank, level 43, with normal status. She can hardly believe the curse is broken. The protagonist explains that his unique ability is to nullify abnormal statuses, and he thought he could nullify the curse if he took it upon himself. He adds, I'm glad it worked. The elf, a bit irritated and relieved, says, are you an idiot or what? Risking so much for someone you don't even know. But then she smiles and thanks him. Anyway, thank you very much for helping me. The protagonist places a hand on her shoulder and replies, you're welcome. The scene shifts to a banquet where the elf is enjoying herself and drinking beer. She comments, the food here is very cheap and the beer is delicious. You really know the good spot, huh? The protagonist responds, I've even been kicked out of here before, but what about you? Are you okay drinking like this? Weren't you gravely injured just a few hours ago? The elf laughs and says, I'm ready for anything. Besides, on a day as good as this, why wouldn't I drink? The protagonist then asks, so, what do you plan to do now? Alicia, she replies, well, I think I'd like to get to know you a little better. Rudd, why did you decide to become an adventurer? He begins to tell his story. A long time ago, the village where I lived was attacked by monsters. They killed my entire family and friends, took everything I had. But thanks to an S-rank adventurer, I survived that tragedy. That S-rank adventurer appeared in front of me when I was just a child. Before me was a gigantic creature, looking like a multi-headed serpent, or perhaps several monstrous snakes. I was crying a lot, staring at the face of that man who smiled at me. He delivered a single blow that disintegrated the monster. Then he approached me, still crying, and just smiled. I will never forget the sight of that adventurer. Since then, my dream has always been to become an S-rank adventurer to help those in need. That has been my greatest goal in life up to now. The elf, smiling, responds, that's a truly great goal. The protagonist asks, but you're not going to laugh at me? Still smiling, she replies, I also dreamed of reaching S rank. I always aimed to get stronger, even before I was cursed. I'm sure I still have comrades trapped in the depths of the Abyss Dungeon. So, no matter what, I will challenge that monster again. But for now, we need to get stronger to achieve our goals. How about forming a team with me? She extends her hand to the protagonist, but as he goes to shake it, other guys appear, grabbing her wrist. One of them says, drinking with a cutie, huh? You miasma butcher? The protagonist recognizes the guys from before and thinks, these guys again. They continue, stop drinking with this guy and come drink with us, sweetheart. The protagonist grabs one of them by the shoulder and says, let her go now. The guy retorts, you've lost your sense of danger. Huh? The elf stands up, asking them to stop, and says, you forgot that we're in a tavern. If you want to fight, there's another way to compete. The scene shifts, and the three are at a table, seeing who can drink the most. The elf stands up, smiling, and says, let the best drinker win. They start drinking intensely. The table fills with beer mugs, and everyone is celebrating. The two guys end up passing out from drinking too much, and the elf, still fine, is declared the winner. She looks happily at the protagonist, who smiles and gives her a thumbs up. He comments, you did great, considering you were already drunk before the competition. She smiles and says, you're my savior. I won't stand by while they ridicule my savior. Then, she collapses into the protagonist's arms. He says, I guess there's no other choice. He activates his substitution ability and says, I transferred your drunkenness to me. After all, I can't get drunk. She, happily, says, first my curse and now my drunkenness. This ability of yours is amazing. I've never seen anything like it. Now, more than ever, I want to form a team with you. Even sober, she continues drinking. The protagonist comments, what a way to say thank you. The scene changes. The elf is looking at the main menu and comments, it's a shame I can't try their main menu. The man then explains, to tell the truth, it seems that monsters have taken over the fishing grounds of Barnama's. I've already sent a request to the guild, but all the high-level adventurers are out. If you two are willing, why not take my request? The scene shows the Barnama's fishing area, with the protagonist and the elf already sailing there. She comments, so these are the Barnama's fishing grounds, huh? Let's defeat these monsters as quickly as possible so we can eat that delicious special dish, says the elf. The protagonist, all excited, agrees. Suddenly, something catches the protagonist's attention, and he quickly dodges something launched from the water. Smiling, he says, ah, finally that monster has arrived. This is what the owner was talking about. The elf, however, doesn't like the situation at all. When the camera shows from above, we see a ridiculous number of these monsters. The protagonist sees that the monsters are level 23 and have high-speed swimming, water bullets, and sniper abilities. They all start launching attacks at him, which he defends with his sword while saying, one shot after another. He realizes that he won't be able to avoid them with the limited space to maneuver. Just as he thinks that, he's thrown into the water. In the water, the protagonist, smiling, says, I'm here, you little fish bastards. The school of fish starts attacking him, but he's no fool and uses his lightning mantle ability, electrocuting them all, since water is an excellent conductor of electricity. After all of them are fried, the protagonist emerges from the water. The elf asks if he's okay, and he replies that he is, but some monsters remain. He notices that the remaining fish are at the bottom and wonders why they're not attacking, guessing they might be protecting something. Shouting to the elf, he says he's going to dive to see what's happening and asks her to do something for him. He ties a rope around his waist and descends to the bottom, passing the monsters. The protagonist notices that the fish neither attack nor flee, concluding they are indeed trying to protect something. As he descends further, he sees a very large creature at the bottom. Analyzing it, he discovers it's level 38, with parasitic poison, autonomy, poison resistance, and accelerated healing abilities. He realizes the creature isn't an anemone, but a giant hermit crab with fish coming out of its tentacles. Understanding that killing just the fish won't solve the problem, the protagonist decides to attack the crab. However, one of the creature's tentacles grabs his leg, and all the fish start attacking him again. He realizes the fish were trying to distract him from the tentacles. Grabbing one of the tentacles, he says, oh, if that's how you want to play, fine, and activates his lightning mantle ability. The protagonist thinks, as long as you're in contact with me, even a body as big as yours shouldn't resist. The creature's tentacles release him, and he remembers the monster's autonomy ability, realizing it cut off its own tentacles to avoid fatal injuries. The creature, furious, charges at the protagonist, who begins to run out of air due to the time spent underwater. He gives a signal by pulling the rope and says, I'm counting on you. Alicia, she responds, leave it to me, and starts casting her magic, pulling the protagonist up at high speed. The scene shifts, showing she managed to pull him to safety. The elf asks the protagonist if he's okay and breathing. He gets up and thanks Alicia for saving his life. The protagonist explains that there's a boss down there continuously producing all those fish and has an accelerated healing ability. He says they need to hurry back and defeat it. Alicia comments that the monsters have a significant advantage underwater and that her magic can't reach them, asking if he has any plan in mind. The protagonist says he needs to make a decision and reveals that he must share his secret with Alicia before she decides to join him. He asks her to keep what he's about to show her a secret, as it will definitely be shocking. The scene shifts to the giant crab in the sea, and the protagonist appears, swimming at high high speed after gaining the high-speed swimming ability by consuming a monster. He easily destroys all the monsters and advances towards the giant boss. The boss tries to stop him with tentacles, but the protagonist easily dodges them, reaching the crab and striking it with his sword before activating his lightning mantle, electrocuting the monster completely. He thinks that with this, the fishing spot should return to peace, but wonders how Alicia feels after discovering that he devours monsters. The protagonist returns to the surface, and not seeing anyone waiting for him, gives a sad smile, thinking he was too hopeful. However, Alicia suddenly appears from the bushes, saying, "Damn, you took your time, huh? I see you didn't get hurt. Did you defeat the boss?" The protagonist, surprised she's still there, confirms that he did. Alicia says, "Thank goodness, I couldn't just wait around, so I started gathering wood to make a fire. It'll be good for drying your clothes, right?" The protagonist asks if she's okay, even after seeing what he did. Alicia responds, "I was a bit surprised, but you trusted me enough to reveal your secret, and that makes me very happy." The protagonist thanks her and mentions that he brought some abilities from the boss with him. He pulls out a net containing pieces of the boss and says, "I brought some things for you too, including some barnamas. I know it might be strange to eat near a monster, but I brought it for you. If you don't want it, that's okay." Alicia happily says she'll eat. The sun is setting, and the protagonist comments, "While we eat, I'll tell you about the first time I ate a monster." At night, while eating, Alicia says the food is delicious and comments, "I'm still very surprised that you eat monsters, so that's the reason, huh?" He replies, "Thanks to this, a weakling like me got one step closer to realizing my dream." She understands and comments, "You used all that power to save me from the adventure hunters and my curse, but when cooked this way, monsters taste pretty good, don't they?" And so, it shows a Neeb's fillet and sautéed tentacle miso. The protagonist then says, "Isn't it? Monsters are surprisingly tasty. I didn't need to eat germs anymore, but I had to cook them the right way. Want to try some?" Alicia, she responds, "No, I can't tell if I'll survive if I eat this, so I'll pass." Alicia finishes her plate and says, "Well, okay, I'll ask just once more. Do you want to join my team?" The protagonist responds, "Alicia, honestly, don't you have more powerful acquaintances for this?" She explains, "It's been 5 years since I was cursed, even if I didn't die in the labyrinth. Considering human lifespan, many have retired. Most frontline adventurers are a bit crazy, and no matter how powerful they are, I can't trust them to watch my back. I'm looking for someone I can trust, and that someone is you, Rudy. I'm sure I can trust you." The protagonist, impressed, smiles and says, "All right, let's form a team, but don't regret it later, okay?" The scene shifts to the Adventurers Guild in the Barnama's division, where Alicia shouts, "Let's get ready for our first day of work." The protagonist comments, "Although I doubt we'll get a good mission. After all, I'm just in E rank." She responds, "You're right, but I already have an idea for our first time." They approach the mission desk girl, and Alicia says, "Excuse me, we're forming a team from today. Could you register us?" The attendant takes her card and is impressed to see it's S rank. She exclaims, "I can't believe what I'm seeing. An S rank adventurer. You are really Alicia from the Emerald Storm." The attendant sees all of Alicia's abilities and asks, "Why is someone like you with the miasma butcher?" The elf doesn't like the comment, and the attendant, realizing, changes the subject. Alicia then says, "We'd like a rank increase for Rudy. What are the requirements?" The attendant takes out some papers and responds, "Well, Rudy has gathered enough achievements. Only the battle achievements are missing." Alicia asks, "Then please give us the toughest subjugation mission you have. We'll handle it together." The attendant agrees, "All right, at the moment, it would be in the outskirts of Barnama's, the extermination of a pack of gray wolves. They are level 11 and have the scent detection ability." The scene changes, showing the protagonist chasing the wolves with his stealth ability, easily tearing them apart. However, looking back, he sees many more wolves chasing him. The protagonist says, "Finally, reinforcements have arrived." Alicia responds, "Now it's my turn to fight." She invokes her spirit power, and a small fairy appears. Alicia asks the fairy to lend her power. The protagonist, impressed, asks if that is Alicia's ability, spirit magic. The wolves advance on Alicia and her fairy. Alicia then exclaims, "Cutting wind." Her power is so absurd that it slices all the wolves, cutting one in half. The protagonist is horrified, realizing that this girl's strength is far beyond what he expected, something he couldn't even dodge. Alicia comments, "I guess my powers, even after being cursed, haven't diminished." The protagonist, impressed, just says, "Oh, okay then, but thanks. I can't even imagine the full strength of this girl." Suddenly, several wolves appear behind the protagonist. He realizes he hadn't noticed all the hidden wolves and thinks he's in trouble, believing he won't be able to block in time. Alicia then activates her power again, and out of nowhere, the protagonist disappears from the wolves' sight at such a speed that they are left confused, looking for him. When they look up, the protagonist is flying with Alicia Alicia's power. He thanks Alicia for saving his life and is impressed with her power, which could even do things like this. Alicia says, "If you want to thank someone, thank this little one. But we can't let our guard down yet. I saw 5 more wolves watching us from the bushes, and there are probably many more hidden around." The protagonist then says, "Well, I guess it's my turn now." He uses his echolocation ability and senses about 30 wolves around them. He says, "Alicia, attack where I indicate, okay?" Using his abilities, the protagonist guides Alicia to attack precisely where the wolves are. Alicia begins attacking them, while the protagonist thinks that echolocation loses precision in open spaces. But if they attack the wolves in circles, they can gather them in a different spot. Alicia says, "Well, okay, I've done my part. Now the rest is up to you." Rudy, looking like a literal monster, the protagonist appears behind the wolves and uses his paralyzing breath ability, causing all the wolves to collapse. Then, he draws his sword and finishes them off. The scene changes, and the protagonist reports, "There are 52 in total." Alicia, incredulous, responds, "Man, I can't believe we found so many in just one day." The protagonist comments, "Maybe their numbers have really increased on a large scale. By the way, what was that spirit magic you used earlier?" Alicia explains, "I can use the magic of the spirits that exist in nature. The spirits are usually everywhere, even if they're not visible. But to use their magic, you first need to use compensatory magic. With that, you can cast powerful spells using little MP. As you saw earlier, it can cause phenomena that allow us to float." The protagonist, surprised, says, "Man, I've never heard of wind magic that strong." Suddenly, the little fairy pulls the protagonist's hair out of nowhere, causing Alicia to laugh. Alicia smiles and says, "Oh, by the way, Sylphide loves to play with others." She then comments, "It'll be dark soon, so let's head back quickly. Let's keep flying." As they flew back home, the protagonist felt like a superhero. He asks Alicia about the other types of magic she can use, and she replies that she's skilled in water, ice, light, and earth magic. "Man, you're basically the Avatar," he exclaims. Alicia adds, "I'm not very good with dark and fire spirits. If a spirit doesn't have good compatibility with you, it will demand a huge amount of magic, or might not even lend you its powers." This shows that Sylphide likes you a lot too. The little fairy keeps tugging on the protagonist's ears, and he comments, "Looks like she really likes me." Alicia smiles at the scene. Suddenly, the protagonist notices smoke in the distance and concludes that there must be a village in that direction. Amid the chaos and the fire consuming the village, they spot a strange and terrifying monster. This monster didn't look like the others the protagonist had faced. It seemed more like a demon than a monster. We then see those people screaming in despair as their homes are engulfed in flames. With that gigantic monster in the midst of the inferno, the creature approaches 2 men, and one of them exclaims, "Damn it, weren't the gray wolves the only monsters in this area? If those wolves were the only things here, what the hell is this in front of us?" That thing is a Baphomet. The creature conjures a summoning symbol, from which a spear enveloped in fire emerges. It hurls the spear at the men, but something protects them. It was our protagonist, using his water bullet ability. The creature watches the protagonist, while an elf approaches the men and asks if they are okay. They respond affirmatively, and she says, "We'll take care of this monster on our own. Please, summarize the situation now." Our protagonist, sword in hand, charges toward the creature. Analyzing it, he confirms it was a level 27 Baphomet, with primary focus magic abilities, echolocation, increased mana recovery speed, earth magic principles, and mental fortification. The protagonist thinks, even if its level is lower than the general lizard, its stats are on another level. I guess this means it's different from common monsters. The creature then summons 4 spears and hurls them at the protagonist without hesitation. He reflects, "The fire magic I have is very weak, not something I can use in battle. But if I manage to defeat this guy, I can use his magic in battle too." This protagonist really wants to devour everyone he sees. Not even the Baphomet escapes. The protagonist advances with his sword to attack, but the monster blocks with its claws. He wonders if that was an iron claw ability, and if so, he will try brute force this time. The monster summons the spears again and launches them in close combat with the protagonist. When it seemed the blow had landed, the protagonist appears right in front of the elf, who asks if he is okay. He responds affirmatively and thinks, "It looks like it dissipated 2 spears this time and kept the others in reserve for defense. It's really a tough opponent." The elf says it seems the creature has raised its guard and suggests exchanging information while they still can. She mentions that the villagers haven't evacuated the town yet and asked the people they met earlier to help with the evacuation. But she still wants to avoid collateral damage, so she can't use powerful magic to defeat the monster in one go. The protagonist thinks, "Alicia must be out of magic thanks to the previous fight and our journey, so we can't rely on her spirit magic. I really need to do something something now. Alicia then says, leave the magic to me, trust me. The protagonist decides to keep advancing, and the monster starts launching multiple attacks in his direction. He manages to dodge them with some ease, and some attacks that were about to hit him are blocked by Alicia. The protagonist gets very close to the Baphomet and thinks she cancelled its magic with an opposite attribute magic of equivalent power. The monster then conjures several rocks and hurls them at the protagonist. With the help of the wind, Alicia tries to protect the protagonist, who breaks some of the rocks with his sword and thinks now they're stone debris of the same mass, and she's conserving magic while avoiding collateral damage. Really, her magic control is insane. But as expected of a former's rank, the protagonist leaps toward the Baphomet and uses his physical enhancement. When the monster tries to defend with its claws, the protagonist manages to tear off all the fingers of one of its hands, leaving it frightened and enraged. With its remaining hand, the monster tries to grab the protagonist, but Alicia, without hesitation, launches an attack that pierces the monster's skull, killing it completely. Alicia then says, so, how does it feel to taste your own power? We only see the image of the monster burning in the flames. People are terrified by everything that's happening, and a man comments, that explosion earlier and that terrible scream. Are those adventurers really going to defeat the creature? Or Sylphide says, I'm sorry, if I hadn't been injured, I could have stayed behind to help them. Alicia then appears in front of those villagers and says, thank you so much for helping with the evacuation. The man is happy to see that she is okay, and she continues, I'm perfectly fine, and the Baphomet has already been defeated. I dealt it a fatal blow, but if it manages to survive, it might try to attack again. We need to go after it now, and for that, I have a small favor to ask. The man, pounding his chest, responds, as long as it's within our reach, we'll do anything to help. Alicia says, well, if you have a little bit of food, could you share it with me? I'm a bit hungry. The scene then shifts to the forest surrounding the village, where the protagonist stands before the monster's corpse. Alicia returns, and the protagonist greets her, asking about the villagers. She replies that everyone evacuated safely, thanks to the adventurers. I told them we decided to go after the Baphomet, so they won't suspect the body disappearing, Alicia adds. The protagonist apologizes and thanks her, already drooling at the thought of eating the monster. Well, now it really looks delicious, he says. The scene changes, and the adventurers have already prepared a Baphomet soup. Veli and my friends, our protagonist really doesn't waste time when it comes to eating monsters, someone comments. The protagonist says they just need to add a bit of mugwort and ginger to finish. When it's done, he begins tasting the monster. The meat still has a strong goat flavor, but ignoring that, it's really delicious, he says. The protagonist gains new abilities, principles of fire magic, principles of earth magic, minor mental reinforcement, iron claws, and minor mana recovery speed. Alicia comments, the meat looks delicious, but watching someone eat a humanoid monster is a bit strange for me, you know? But I have to get used to it. The protagonist, a bit awkwardly, agrees. Well, she's right, and it's a little scary how I've already gotten used to all this. Suddenly, next to them, appear a species of pigs called stamp pigs, all level 22, with the quick step ability. They rise alert, ready for battle. The protagonist comments that there are a lot of monsters in that place. Since it's come to this, it's finally time to debut my combat magic, he says, extending his hand toward the pigs. However, to everyone's surprise, the attack doesn't work. At that moment, the pigs activate their quick step and nearly hit the two. The Baphomet soup spills entirely on the ground, and Alicia comments, I thought you could use magic now. I'm low on magic at the moment, so I can't help you for long. The protagonist responds that it's unforgivable, and Alicia doesn't quite understand what he means. I drained all the blood and removed all the filth. How long do you think it took me to do that? I really wanted to savor that meat, so I did my best to season it. Now, these bastards are going to pay for everything they did. You're going to give me your meat, the protagonist says, full of rage, charging at the pigs. Alicia holds the protagonist back and asks him to calm down. The ability they just used is called Quick Step. It increases their burst power, making any attack quite strong. Even if it's not favorable, we should fight from a distance to avoid the Quick Step's reach. In other words, we need to retreat for now. The two run from the monsters and manage to hide up in a tree. Alicia comments, it looks like we managed to lose them. The protagonist then opens his analysis and starts examining the abilities he gained, both fire and earth magic. He reads that those with these abilities will instinctively understand how to cast these spells. It says here that I should understand instinctively, he comments. Alicia responds, well, so you still can't use it. This can only mean one thing. Your brain is so limited that it can't even comprehend the magic. The protagonist, slightly offended, retorts, that was a bit too harsh, wasn't it? Alicia ponders. Even so, you can already use fire magic, even if it's weak. So, this doesn't explain why you can't use this magic. Maybe to use the monster's magic abilities, you need to learn to manipulate mana. The protagonist says, well, I get it. It's not just having the magic, but also needing to manipulate it, right? Alicia responds, well, I don't know much about mana, but if it's like absorbing monster abilities, maybe you'll do fine. The protagonist then says, I'll give it a try. He extends his hand again and tries to remember. Well, it's like when I ate that minotaur, that sudden surge of incredible power. What if I could materialize that outside my body? Suddenly, to Alicia's and the protagonist's surprise, he finally manages to conjure magic. He becomes very happy and thinks, as long as I can feel the mana, I can use it as if it were part of my body. He then unleashes a powerful fire attack towards the pigs, causing a massive explosion in the middle of the forest. The scene shifts, and we see the spirits of the pigs wandering in the sky, while the protagonist is completely content eating the new monster meat. He comments that he's excited to eat stamped pig ribs. Sorry for making you wait so long, says the protagonist. Alicia responds, don't worry, I know this is something you need to do. Although you're making a very annoying face right now. To use magical abilities, you need to use mana, right? And your mana doesn't seem to have depleted at all from the previous attacks, so I think you can use it continuously. The protagonist replies, yes, when I felt the mana spreading through my body, I immediately understood how to use my abilities. If mana can substitute for magical power, then maybe I can use it to strengthen my body and weapons. Among adventurers, many choose to polish their magical skills, and most use close combat. By circulating magical power through the body, their physical abilities are also enhanced, and without using any weapon, the attack power increases significantly. It's even possible to emit magical slashes. Alicia then says, I think I understand. Until now, you didn't have much magic, so you really couldn't use those abilities, right? He responds, yes, and right now, it seems I have a lot more mana than magic, but the most important thing is that it looks like I can replenish my mana by eating monsters. The protagonist finishes off that monster and gains the quick step ability. Alicia thinks, in other words, he absorbs mana through food and can even store it in his body. But the most important thing is that those pork ribs look very delicious. The protagonist then asks, so, do you feel like eating now, Alicia? She replies, no, I'm good. Suddenly, an explosion occurs next to the protagonist and Alicia, and a gigantic pig appears in front of them. The protagonist comments, oh, so the boss finally showed up. However, at an incredible speed, the monster is already in front of the protagonist and Alicia, impressing both with its swiftness. The monster starts devastating the forest, and the protagonist, moving at incredible speed, manages to save Alicia. She thanks him for saving her life, but reflects, the moment I felt something distant. That creature was already right in front of me. But what really happened? We're not in a dungeon, so what's a monster like that doing here? The protagonist then comments, again and again, the food I prepared just fell on the ground. Tell these bastards to stop interrupting my meal. Looking at the monster, he says, by the way, that monster would make a good stew, don't you think? He continues, but it seems to have a fire resistance ability, so I don't think we could roast it, even if we put oil on its body. The monster was the King Stamp Pig, level 38, with quick step and fire resistance abilities. The protagonist comments, its stats are pretty high too. He uses the principle of earth magic ability and thinks, he only has quick step and fire resistance. The protagonist says, get ready to feel my wrath, the wrath of a glutton. He launches a gigantic stone hand at the monster, but the monster easily breaks it with a headbutt. The protagonist realizes the monster's head is made of iron. The monster then hits the protagonist with a headbutt, brutally launching him far away. The protagonist crashes hard into a tree and falls to the ground. The monster then charges at Alicia, and she activates the power of Sylph, launching multiple wind slashes at the monster. Alicia thinks, well, somehow I managed to hit him, but he's not using any abilities. His muscles and fur are really tough and thick. Whether it's earth magic or wind spirit magic, they won't have enough power to penetrate that monster. The monster was already preparing to charge at her again, and she realized he was really coming. Suddenly, our protagonist activates his roar ability, paralyzing the monster. Then he says, don't you dare ignore me here. I'm not done with you yet, you damned pig. The protagonist thinks the monster can't use quick step or iron body now, but if he tries to turn this into a battle of attrition, there's a chance he might start targeting Alicia. He thinks, well, I have an ability that could take him down with just one attack. Although it seems he can only charge in a straight line, this is the first time I'm going to use this. The protagonist closes his eyes, raises his sword, and says, well, I guess I should try this first. Gather the mana from within your body and imagine it flowing into your sword. The monster was very close to hitting the protagonist, and when he opens his eyes, he unleashes an attack that slices the monster in half with a single strike. After cutting the monster in half, the protagonist is is very surprised at how easily he managed it. Alicia, impressed with wide eyes, says, "You used mana to strengthen your weapon and without any practice." He responds, "Well, I tried because I felt I could, and my mana was leaking out." Suddenly, the protagonist's sword can't handle it and breaks, leaving him very sad since his beloved sword had broken. He becomes depressed, hanging his head low, and says, "I used it a lot, so there wasn't much I could do." Alicia comments, "It seems it couldn't handle the amount of mana you put into it. The weapon is practically an extension of an adventurer's body, so I'm sure you feel this loss. But whatever the case, let's call it a day." The protagonist says, "But as for this guy, you can bet I'm taking some of his meat." As expected of our monster eater, the scene shifts to the miasma dungeon on the 7th layer, where some people are fighting giant rats. After defeating the rats, one of them comments, "Really? A superior species of miasma rats. These guys are pretty tough opponents, huh?" The other responds, "Even so, they were no match for our teamwork." They start laughing next to the rat's body. Suddenly, one of them moves to the side, and his friends ask what happened. He responds, "I thought I heard someone's voice coming from over here." The boy says, "Huh, but why is there a staircase in this place?" The guy responds, "Could it be a secret passage in this dungeon? Let's take a look." They go down the stairs and find a chest. After checking, they comment, "It doesn't seem to be a trap." Another wonders what might be inside the chest and if it would be a treasure. They open the chest and find a very impressive sword. They are happy because the sword looks very strong. The guy who picked up the sword says he can feel the magic emanating from it, and that they could probably sell it for a good price. Another comments, "Magic? Are you sure this thing isn't cursed?" The other replies, "Stop being so pessimistic. We haven't seen the miasma butchers for a long time, so we've been struggling without an easy way to make money. This is actually a blessing from the heavens to reward our hard work." The guy agrees, saying they've been adventuring late into the night, and it's better if this really is a blessing. Another then comments, "Speaking of the miasma butcher, I heard he's been hanging around with a really beautiful elf now." The other says, "That miasma butcher thinks he's something, doesn't he? Next time we see him, we'll teach him a lesson and put him in his place." The chubby guy was still apprehensive about everything and kept eyeing the chest from which they had taken the sword. In a close-up of the sword, it seemed to whisper, "Kill." The scene shifts to the frontier town of Bologna, where the protagonist comments, "About my new weapon. I was thinking of getting some tips from the owner of a weapon shop I know." He arrives at a weapon shop called Dorita's Wealth, owned by a man named Dom. The man looks at the protagonist's broken sword and says, "For a sword I forged personally to break like this, I'm sure brute force alone wouldn't do it. Rudd, what did you imbue this sword with?" Alicia whispers to Rudd, asking if he's going to tell Dom everything that happened. Rudd responds, "I'll explain everything. I've known old Dom for a long time, and he's not the type to go around spilling others' secrets." The scene cuts to the protagonist literally telling Dom everything. The man comments, "So, you're eating monsters, huh? When you eat these monsters, you gain their abilities. That's why Rudd's power has skyrocketed." Alicia says, "Huh, but you don't seem too surprised." Dom responds, "Well, as long as it tastes good, it doesn't matter much what he eats. The most important thing is that you want a sword capable of withstanding a mana-imbued strike, right? Considering the research time, it'll take a while before I can forge a new weapon for you." Rudd asks if there's anything he can do to help with that. Dom replies, "It would be useful to have some high-quality magic stones." Rudd says, "In that case, I have some materials with me." When he lays the stones on the table, Dom is astonished. General Lizard and Baphomet, even a magic stone from a minotaur. "Boy, I see your skills have improved a lot." Rudd, embarrassed, responds, "Wow, being praised by you, old man, that's pretty satisfying for me." Dom says, "Well, if I need anything else, I'll let you know. In the meantime, use this sword here, but under no circumstances, absolutely none, imbue it with your mana. If you break this sword too, I'll charge you an outrageous compensation. I hope I've made myself clear." The scene shifts to a bar where Alicia and Rudd are. Alicia says, "Let's try to avoid those magical attacks from now on, okay?" Rudd responds, "Really? Old Dome gets very scary when it comes to his weapons." Alicia comments, "Even though he's a bit intense, I'm glad to finally meet a friend of yours." Rudd says, "Sorry for being such a loner." Suddenly, the guys who found the mysterious sword appear behind Alicia and say, "Looks like you two are having a lot of fun, huh? Mind if we join you, miasma butcher?" Alicia stands up and asks, "Do you have a problem with us?" Yes, let's settle this with a drinking contest like good old adventurers." Suddenly, the guy holding the sword collapses onto the table. His friend asks, "Dude, are you okay? Are you drinking alone or something?" He notices his friend is still clutching the sword and says, "Wait, Rondo, you haven't sold that damn thing yet?" The sword whispers the same word, "Kill." The guy starts having a seizure on the table and suddenly screams at the sword to shut up. He attacks his own friends, slashing one of them across the chest, then charges at Alicia. As he tries to strike her, the protagonist steps in, and Rudd says, "This won't end with just a simple drinking contest." Rudd thinks, "What's wrong with this guy?" The guys at the next table comment, "What the hell are you thinking? What are you doing in the middle of our celebration? You idiot. You better get out of here now." They start to restrain the crazed guy, but the sword keeps urging him to kill, and he begins slashing everyone around him, shocking even the establishment's owner. Alicia then says, "Manager, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to destroy that wall." She unleashes a powerful strike on the madman, creating a huge hole in the wall. Poor manager, he's going to have to break the piggy bank to fix that massive hole. To Alicia's surprise, the guy gets up again. The protagonist, mouth agape, asks, "Alicia, did you hold back?" She responds, "Well, he's a mediocre adventurer. He shouldn't be standing after that." The guy charges again, screaming that he's going to kill everyone. Rudd comments, "This is really bad." Alicia says, "If you can use healing magic, please heal everyone here." The scene shifts to the protagonist fighting the guy named Hondo, a level 22 human with madness status. The protagonist realizes that Hondo has gone berserk and his stats are incredibly high. Alicia shouts for Rudd to get back and says she's going all out this time. She unleashes a powerful blast towards Hondo, hitting him directly, but notices that his sword simply absorbs it. She comments, "That sword is definitely cursed." Rudd asks if Hondo is getting stronger by absorbing magic. Red tendrils begin to cover Hondo's body as he charges at the protagonist again. Rudd manages to defend with his sword, but with great difficulty due to the immense strength. His sword is knocked aside, and the protagonist starts deflecting the attacks, managing to cut Hondo's leg. However, the red tendrils cover the wounds. Alicia thinks, "If I try to support with my magic, the sword might absorb it again. If I want to help Rudd, I need to find an opening and deliver a decisive blow." Hondo's friend pleads, "Please, don't kill him. I know we've done horrible things to you, but for a loser like me, these two guys became my safe havens. Please, I beg you, don't kill him." Rudd, smiling, says, "All right, I'll try. I'll do my best. I think I'll try substitution." Rudd asks Alicia to leave Hondo to him for now, and she agrees. Rudd thinks, "When I used substitution on Alicia, it took about 10 seconds. The problem is how to keep him under control while I try to free him from the curse." Hondo's attacks worry Alicia. The protagonist thinks those strikes are really heavy, but if he can immobilize just the sword, he might be able to do something. He activates his earth magic principles, creating several earth hands to restrain Hondo. The protagonist thinks the sword won't be able to absorb the magic and successfully immobilizes him. Rudd then thinks, "If the cause of his status is a curse, I can get rid of it the same way I got rid of Alicia's." He activates his substitution ability, which begins to take effect on Hondo's body, and the red tendrils start to unravel. Hondo, crying, pleads for the protagonist's help, but the curse is stronger than expected, and the protagonist is thrown away from Hondo's body. Alicia asks if he's okay, and he replies that he is. The protagonist realizes that his substitution failed, likely because it wasn't Hondo rejecting the ability, but the sword itself. He thinks, maybe if we weaken that sword a bit more, I can make it work. The protagonist then activates his fire magic principles and directs it at Hondo, who is now completely covered by the red tendrils. Hondo manages to split the protagonist's flames in half, and the protagonist thinks, "He easily broke through the restraints, and I only managed to lift the curse from his left arm." The protagonist decides to focus on attacking outside the range of Hondo's right arm. Hondo charges at him insanely, and the protagonist notices his movements have changed significantly. But what's most troubling is that the sword is absorbing the magic again. Suddenly, the sword begins to glow with an intense, malevolent aura enveloping the entire area. Suddenly, we see claws and feet that are entirely different from Hondo's. Alicia wonders if this is an incarnation, meaning that Hondo's body no longer belongs to him. In the sky, we see the full form of the sword, a figure of a completely insane demon with an unknown level. At incredible speed, the creature charges at the protagonist, and as the blade is about to strike him, he barely manages to dodge. Rudd tries to face the demon, but is sent flying with a single blow, making him cough up blood from the impact. The protagonist thinks its movements are extremely fast, but no, it's not that fast. In fact, it's not making any unnecessary movements, like a very skilled and experienced warrior. Suddenly, the creature is already behind Rudd, surprising him, with the blade coming at his head again. Alicia steps in to help Rudd, deflecting the blow. The protagonist thinks he needs to circulate the magical power within his body. Alicia charges at the monster and unleashes an immense power at its abdomen, sending it flying. Alicia says to Rudd, "Looks like I'll have to stay between you two for a while." "Huh." Rudd responds, "Thank you so much. You really saved me." Alicia, "I didn't know you could fight up close. I thought all your powers were were for long range. Alicia comments, a support that becomes useless as soon as the enemy gets close is nothing but dead weight. However, that creature is not a simple opponent we can take lightly. Any slip up will be fatal, even for me, an XS rank adventurer. Alicia tells Rudd, you need to change your mindset. Rudd, Hondo's curse has progressed too far, and he can't be stopped unless his heart is completely destroyed. The protagonist gets angry for underestimating the creature and blames himself. A man tells him to stop moving, as his wounds haven't healed yet. But the boy gets up and asks, what did that elf girl say earlier? You heard it, right? The scene shifts to Rudd and Alicia fighting the creature. Rudd thinks that even with both of them fighting together, they couldn't create a decent opening to face the monster. He comments that the monster's double head gives it a much wider field of vision. The protagonist calls Alicia's attention, asking her to fall back a bit. Without hesitation, Alicia retreats. Alicia thinks, if my magic is only to kick up dust, he won't be able to absorb it. In the midst of the dust, the protagonist appears and slashes the monster's back. Then, with the power of the earth spirits, Alicia casts a spell called Nomia, but the shot doesn't fully pierce the monster's heart, surprising Alicia greatly. Without hesitation, the monster charges at her. However, to everyone's surprise, their chubby friend grabs the monster by the arm and throws it away. Thus, the two friends come to help both Rudd and Alicia. The chubby friend then says he will stop his friend even if it kills him, and the other asserts that if they were to die, it would have to be the three of them together. Incredibly, they manage to pierce the monster's heart with the sword, leading to an unexpected conclusion.